This is the John Steigerwald Show on AM 1250. The Answer.
Well, as we've mentioned here a few times, the coronavirus has been a nightmare for just about everybody, but one group that seems to be benefiting is the crime-committing community. It's been a get-out-of-jail-free virus for a lot of them, and the cops are busy doing other things. One place where the crime-committing community seems to be thriving is Philadelphia. Benjamin Manis of the City Journal calls it Philadelphia's only surging industry. Ben, thanks for being here.
Hey, John, thanks for having me on. I got to be honest, with the football career that I had in high school, I never thought I'd be talking to you.
Well, here we are. So are you a Pittsburgh guy?
Nope, I live in Philadelphia. I'm originally a New Yorker, and despite the decade I did in Washington, D.C. and law enforcement there, I've mainly been between New York and Philly my life.
Okay, so how much has it surged there in Philadelphia, the crime industry?
So, there's two things to consider here. What's happening in Philly and the national implications to what may be happening in Pittsburgh, as well as, a variety of urban environments nationwide. So here in Philly, what we're seeing, and it mirrors also what's happening in New York right now because, retail is closed. People are off the streets. So the type of crimes you traditionally see, store robberies, shoplifting, anything involving like a street stick-up or a pickpocket, that's down. And believe me, the political, people, the powers that be, seize the opportunity to run out there and say, hey, crime's down, amid this coronavirus thing, which is fine, except what we're seeing in Philly, which should be, extremely disturbing, is that violent crime is up. And not just a violent crime like domestic violence and sex assault, which can be related to being cooped up. We see in places like colder environments, Canada, Alaska, where people are cooped up, those type of crimes surge. But street murder, which is kind of the hinge pin of any good crime stat nationwide, because you can't make a body disappear and you can't fix that stat the way some people fix stats in law enforcement. Well, we're seeing those rising here in the city of brotherly love, up a whopping 19% on a year so far. And, it's less to do with coronavirus and more to do with the terrible policies set forth by the political leaders of the city.
And you, as you said, you have a long background in law enforcement. What's it like for a guy who knows how things are supposed to be done to be living in a place where it's just absolutely out of control?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is my second turn at this rodeo. I grew up in New York when it was really out of control, and I actually saw, the way it turned around during the Giuliani administration into mid to late 90s. And then I went to Washington, D.C., where, the D.C. crime rate is, we had 181 murders in our last year there. In a city of only, 500,000, and then to come to Philly and see those trends follow here in a city with the fourth largest law enforcement in the United States, it's disheartening because we've solved this problem before. We've created formulas that were adopted nationwide to fix street crime. And what we're seeing now in political trends, is that people are caring less about criminal justice and more about social justice when it comes to voting. And it's not just Philly. In Pittsburgh, you saw some pretty inexplicable actions on behalf of DA's appeal. And this Mick Pappas that was elected to magistrate there, which, it has really nothing to do with any proven theorem in law enforcement and criminal justice and everything to do with, this progressive voting bloc that's been put together to try to seize the youth vote.
And this progressive voting bloc is funded by George Soros. Hasn't he taken up the cause of district attorneys, district attorney candidates all over the country, and spent lots of money trying to get idiots like this guy in Philadelphia elected?
Yeah, and I'm glad you called him an idiot because it's exactly what he is. We have a guy, Larry Krasner, who was elected. First, he was elected through a five-way primary against a former deputy mayor, against a former assistant DA, against a former judge here in Philly, because we don't have magistrates. We have, you start at common pleas in municipal court. And, we had a situation where this guy was able to, without any prosecutorial experience whatsoever, beat a 5-way primary and then beat a Republican challenger. Granted, this is a very blue city, but the Republican challenger being, a single female who'd spent her entire career in the DA's office, was a perfect candidate, because she'd just been blue-collar Philly the whole way. And, he beat it because he had $1.45 million from George Soros' various PACs, and he bought up all the expensive media time here. So, this is not unique to Philly. DAs in Orlando, Chicago, Baltimore, San Francisco, Chesapeake, and various other cities have seen this kind of money being dropped into the DA's race. And I'll tell you, John, it isn't just because of progressive ideology. It's a formula that Soros has figured out that's pretty unbeatable, that no one on the Republican side of the aisle is figured out to beat. A DA next to a mayor gets more media, more press, more television coverage than any other local elected official. So what he's doing by buying up these relatively cheap elections nationwide is seeding the next 10 years of national elections, because these are the people that go on to run for Congress and Senate.
Yeah, but, when you see what this guy has done and what this guy had done, this Larry Krasner, before he became the DA, you point out in your story, he sued the cops 75 times. He represented organizations like Black Lives Matter. And he called the police, who he now kind of oversees as a district attorney, or at least works with, he calls them systematically racist. So he got elected. Who votes for somebody like this? I mean, you can spend $1 zillion, but what are you promoting? How do you get reelected with that kind of a background?
So the municipal elections that year, and this is another formula that needs to be beat. This is pulling a trend that these people aren't traditional voters. So when we did the autopsy of the election, trying to figure out how such a lunatic could become the chief law enforcement officer of a major U.S. city, we figured out that the voter increases by precinct were in youth areas. They were in people who just moved to Philly. We have a lot of telecommuters that are moving in and gentrifying neighborhoods. We have people in University City where we have, two very large colleges kind of crammed together who were never registered in Philly before. So if you were, in somewhere else in the Commonwealth and you went to Temple or you went to Penn or you went to Drexel, you traditionally held on to your driver's license where you were from. Well, now they're, going into these places where people are uninformed voters and saying, hey, be part of this change, man. And they're registering you to vote in Philly, and you're pulling the lever without really knowing the difference. And then you're leaving town before you're having to deal with the consequences of, a 19% surge in violent crime. He's also basically pandering to, several identity votes. And the sad thing about that is, he's doing it in a way that hurts the very people that he's pandering to, whether it be the woman vote, because, Larry Krasner actually has a serious problem advocating for the abusers, not the victims of abuse in domestic assaults and domestic murders, whether it be the murder of Tavonia Love when he was running for DA, or his most recent revelation in big trial, which is the Philly Log Grog, where he basically, his office covered up a near-death domestic assault committed by a Honduran illegal immigrant on his spouse because, he was at the point where he'd have to turn that person into ICE, and he didn't want to do that. His office had opposed ICE. Just basically made the charges disappear.
Unbelievable. And so I just, before you were on, Ben, and we're talking to Ben Manis of the City Journal, you can see his piece at city-journal.org, Philadelphia's only surging industry, and it's crime. We had someone on from Portland talking about what's going on in Portland just a few minutes ago, and the insanity out there with Antifa getting away with doing whatever they want. And I see in your story that the new police chief, or police commissioner, I guess it's called, in Philadelphia, she comes from where?
Portland.
Of course.
By way of Oakland, which is, another one. I actually have very high respect for West Coast law enforcement because a lot of my best case scenarios, coming up through grad school and looking comparatively in law enforcement agencies have been from West Coast agencies. They tend to do better with smaller numbers. But Oakland and Portland in the recent years are not the part and parcel examples I'm giving to those equations. And I want to give her the benefit of the doubt because I try not to judge my brethren and sisters in blue. But, I believe in meritocracy. I don't believe someone who had a command of 700 to 900 tops in her entire career should be rewarded by taking over a job of 6,600, especially when we passed the annual number of homicides that Portland had last year in January here in Philadelphia. Last year total, we clocked in at 354 murders, which is actually more than New York, which is 8 times our size, got in their year. So when you look at that, you shouldn't reward things to people who just maybe aren't ready for that. And we have a history of that. We gave Charles Ramsey out of D.C., who was said in the rumor mill to be the person who recommended Downey Outlaw to become our police commissioner here in Philly. Well, Ramsey was the D.C. police chief that year. I told you we had 181 murders. And they gave him Philadelphia to run after that. So if that trend was to complete, we would have had a ridiculous amount of murders here. I believe you should reward people not based on their politics or their optics, but their ability to lead. And you have to do that by looking only at the resume and not at anything else. So I'd love to see who was on the short list. Of course, City Council and the mayor's office didn't publish that. But I want to give her the benefit of the doubt. I just am not seeing that. I mean, literally, this woman's first major task as police commissioner after 2 very violent weeks in the interim when she was coming on board was to allow nail polish for female officers on the job. That was the first decree she made. Sorry, that's bad optics no matter how you cut it.
Wow. Now, this sounds like a lot of juicy stuff for the media that could be having a heyday with this, covering this. And unfortunately, according to your story, the Philadelphia Inquirer doesn't seem all that interested in exposing the idiocy.
Yeah, I mean, they published one of my pieces recently, so I can't throw them completely under the bus because I was quite surprised that they actually published me in regards to the Krasner fiasco. But, it's been called out numerous times. The legal blog here in town is, Ralph Cipriano, who used to be with the Inquirer. And Ralph is, the guy who got the Pulitzer for covering the Archdiocese scandal, the child abuse scandal. And he's the first guy to say, for every negative piece covering corruption in either the Kenney or Krasner administration, Jim Kenney's our mayor here, there's 5 or 10 progressive hoax stories about people, who've been benefited somehow by this progressive leadership. And the problem is, there's nothing wrong with criminal justice reform. It's probably something we've needed for quite some time now. I've had my problems with the criminal justice system, especially in D.C. When I was working there. But the truth of the matter is, the way people like Krasner nationwide are going about this reform is completely backwards. Giving someone a second chance means they've reformed themselves and they deserve a second chance. Not charging people in the street and then the paper basically not covering these crimes so that they completely, go under the radar is dangerous. And it's only victimizing the people in the very community where these people are running around. So if you're not giving someone bail, like Pappas is famous for, because you don't think they can afford bail, they're back on the street victimizing the other people in that poverty-stricken community who can't afford bail, which is wrong.
I have less than a minute here, Ben. Just to wrap up here, what does the average person in Philadelphia walking around the city think about all this? I mean, how does this? At what point do the citizens notice this and say maybe this isn't a good idea?
Yeah, I think the citizens are very aware of this, but they don't have an alternative, and that's a huge problem in a one-party town. We need to look seriously about who our candidates are. The people in Philly really hate Mayor Kenny. He had a 40% approval rate, and then he got reelected. Krasner may not get reelected, but who's he up against? Right now, the only other person who's raised their hand is another defense attorney with no prosecution experience. So we need to get serious about who we elect. When New York broke a 60-year Democratic trend, they did it with a famous mob prosecutor who took down the Gotti, John Gotti. Who is our famous, self-funded person who could beat a machine that's 60 years in the making here in Philly? Good question.
Yeah, well, those machines are everywhere. We have, I think we've had a Democratic mayor here for 75 years, something like that. Seems to be happening a lot. Hey Ben, thanks for being here. Great story. People should check it out at city-journal.org. Ben Maness, thanks a lot. Have you on again sometime.
John, anytime. Thanks for having me.
All right. Okay, thank you, and we'll be right back.